What is up, my friends? What is going on? Today, I have a very exciting video for you. One that I know you have been waiting for a really long time. One that I've been avoiding making for a really long time. And the reason being is because it's complicated. There is a lot going on and a lot I'm going to try to explain in today's video as we go through Prosperous Innkeeper Endurance Bowmaster loops. Very exciting. Up until this point, before the release of Green Sun Zenith, there wasn't as much of a need to learn these loops or memorize them because we had access to Blood Artist in the deck with 4 Court of Callings. It didn't make as much sense to run the cards necessary for this loop as it does now. Because of the presence of Green Sun Zenith, it now makes much more sense to run Prosperous Innkeeper, and for that reason, it makes much more sense to know these loops, and it makes less sense to run Blood Artist if you're playing in paper tournaments. So I'm going to try to simplify these loops for you today. I'm going to try to create some common threads, some commonalities between all these loops, some general rules that you can apply to all of the loops to simplify your understanding, expedite your learning, and make these a lot of fun. But before we jump into the loops, I do have to give a huge shout out, a big thank you to my Patreon who funded this project and forced me to learn these loops to a level where I could teach them back to you. So thank you to all you guys for your support. I'm humbled by your support, incredibly grateful, and I feel the love, immense amounts of love. So thank you so much for continuing to stick around and stick with me and make this community a better place. So thank you guys. All right, so now that we've established what we're talking about today, I'm gonna pop off the screen and I'm gonna show you guys some of the general rules associated with learning these loops. So a lot of people think of these loops as Orcish Bowmaster loop, but largely these loops are contingent upon the card Prosperous Innkeeper. If Innkeeper is not in the deck, these loops do not work. There are 3 different loops you have access to based upon the cards you have in play and your desired outcome. Each loop has a different goal. Loop 1, the goal is to make a 2-drop. Loop 2, the goal is to make damage. And loop 3, the goal is also to make damage, but do so at a lesser cost. There are a few consistent principles associated with all of these loops, so for every single loop, these things will be the same. It is important to know and learn these principles, which are fairly basic, so that you can simplify your understanding of what we're doing here. All of these loops start with 4 core cards. I call them the Fantastic 4. 2 Yawgmoths, 1 Prosperous Innkeeper, and 1 Yawgmoth. That is your Fantastic 4. All 4 of those cards are in all 3 loops and necessary to get the loops started. The second principle, which is consistent across the board with all of these loops, is how you are going to stack your endurance triggers. If you are evoking 2 endurances into play, you will always have the triggers as follows: shuffle, evoke, and shuffle. That is consistent across the board. You don't have to think about it if you're evoking 2 endurances. There is an instance in the 3rd loop where you will only be evoking 1 endurance. With that case, you will be putting the evoke on the bottom and the shuffle on the top. The 3rd principle associated with all of these loops, the thing that you need to be mindful of, is that there's a consistent process for each of the loops. You're going to be making creatures, you're going to be making mana, and then you're going to be using the mana. So step 1 is going to be make creatures, step 2 is going to be make mana, step 3 is going to be use the mana. Say it with me: make creatures, make mana, use the mana. We're going to do that consistently, as you'll see throughout these loops. Lastly, it's important to know your goal. What's the outcome you're trying to get from these loops? If you know the outcome, a lot of times you can just figure out the course to get there. You're going to see 2 common outcomes that you're shooting for from these loops. One is going to be make mana. If you need to make mana, the way that you're going to do that is with Prosperous Innkeeper. The only way you can continuously do that is if Prosperous Innkeeper winds up in your graveyard. So if you want to make mana, you're going to need to sacrifice Prosperous Innkeeper at some point. The second goal is to make damage, and I'm using the word make very intentionally. I want things to be consistent and streamlined for you, so you have a similar thought process as you're going through each of these loops and each of these steps. So we made mana, we have to sacrifice Prosperous Innkeeper. If we want to make damage, we have to sacrifice Orcish Bowmaster at some point. Mana, Innkeeper into the graveyard. Damage, Bowmaster into the graveyard. So 4 consistent principles, the Fantastic Four, Yawgmoths, Prosperous Innkeeper, and Yawgmoth. Your endurance triggers will always be the same if there's 2 endurances. If there's 1 endurance, it's going to be evoke and then shuffle. Know the process. Make creatures, make mana, use the mana. Make creatures, make mana, use the mana. And lastly, know your goal. If you need to make mana, you need to get Prosperous Innkeeper into your graveyard. If you need to deal damage, you need to get Bowmaster into the graveyard. Now that we know these consistent principles, let's go through the specifics of each of the loops. All right, friends, here we go. We are starting off with loop 1. The ultimate goal of this loop is to get a 2-drop creature into play, either Hapatra, or if you're playing Blood Artist, get a Blood Artist into play. The first step of this loop is to make a creature. The creature we're going to make is going to be a 1-drop or a Dryad Arbor. In order to do that, we need to have a 1-drop into our graveyard. So in this instance, we're going to be putting this 1-drop from play into our graveyard. If we already had a 1-drop in our graveyard or a Dryad Arbor in our graveyard, we would not need to do this. So how do we do that? We do what we already know how to do. We're going to draw 2 cards, and I've set up my library in a way that it's the worst possible scenario. So Endurance, and Court of Calling are the bottom of my library. So I drew 2 cards. Last card I'm going to draw, I'm going to sacrifice the Halfling and draw the 3rd card. Now, as you know how to do, well, Endurance, discard 2 cards, 2 green cards. I'm going to set them off camera, but every time we do this, we'll be discarding two green cards. Triggers are going to be the same as we mentioned with regards to the consistent principles section of this video. So the triggers are going to be shuffle, evoke, shuffle. With those on the stack, we're going to cast our Court of Calling for X equals 1. This has already been shuffled in because of that first trigger. And now, Court for 1. Get our Halfling into play. It's going to trigger the Innkeeper. This will go to the graveyard. Endurances will go to the graveyard because they're evoke triggers. Shuffle trigger resolves, and there's our library. So that's step 1. Step 2, we need to now make mana. How are we going to do that? We need to get Prosperous Innkeeper into the graveyard. So let's reset here. Those 2 will draw 2. For the 3rd draw, we're going to sack our Innkeeper, draw the last card in our library, and now we'll evoke our endurances again. We'll discard 2 more green cards. This is going to shuffle into our library based on the way we stacked our triggers. Chord for 2. Innkeeper comes into play. It's going to trigger make a treasure. Graveyard, graveyard, graveyard. Shuffle into my library. And that is steps A and B. We now have to repeat those steps. So it's going to cost us 4 more cards. And as a result of that, we're going to get a 2nd treasure. Note that you'll be netting life each time you do this as well. Not particularly relevant in most instances. Now that we have 2 mana, we're going to make use of that mana. If you're operating at sorcery speed, you can do one of 2 things. You can either cast Hapatra from your hand, or cast Blood Artist if you're playing it. If you are operating at instant speed, the way we get around this is by proliferating with Yawgmoth, discarding the Hapatra, and then going through our loops again. Draw cards, draw another card. We're switching with our Yawgmoths here. Evoke our endurances. I don't have enough green cards because this isn't the full deck, but assume I discarded 2 green cards. Hapatra's in the deck. Chord for 2. Hapatra into play. Graveyard, 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 and they shuffle back in. So that is the completion of loop 1, which nets us ultimately a 2-drop creature into play. Alright, so now that we have our 2-drop in play, what can we do with it? We can start dealing damage. The setup for this part of the combo is our Fantastic Four, along with Hapatra. We don't need this 1-drop in play. Step 1 of this loop is going to be the same as step 1 of our previous loop. we are going to make creatures. In the previous loop, we made a 1-drop. In this loop, we're going to be making snakes. Let's start by resetting our young wolves, make 2 snake. We're going to denote the snakes with dice because we're going to be making a lot of them. For our 3rd snake, we're going to be sacrificing the Innkeeper. You can target one of your wolves, we'll make a 3rd snake. We're drawing cards in the process, so now we've drawn the 3 cards that are left in our library into our hand. Same song and dance as before. Evoke 2 endurances, discard 2 green cards, 2 green cards. We're going to stack our triggers the same. Our goal here is to make mana. So we made creatures, and now we're going to make mana. Innkeeper goes back into the library. We're going to Court of Calling, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll tap one of our snakes. Worst case scenario, this Hapatra's tapped, so you could say that it's tapped right now so we don't have access to it. So we'll go down 2 snakes untapped, 1 snake tapped, Cord resolves, get our Innkeeper. Same step 2 as our other loop. We're making mana, treasure into play, Cord, endurance, endurance, get shuffled back. Okay, now that we've gone through that sequence once, much like our first loop, we're going to go through that sequence again. We're going to make creatures, and then we're going to make mana. First way we make creatures, same as last time. Sack a young wolf. You can target another creature in play. You can target your Hapatra if you want to. You can target a tapped snake. We'll target a tapped snake. We'll make another snake. We'll gain 2 life off of that. Draw a card. Loop it again. Make another snake. Draw another card. Same thing as last time. Sacrifice the Innkeeper. Target a wolf. Make another snake. Draw another card. Same situation as before, except now we have more snakes untapped. Evoke. Evoke. Discard 2 cards. 2 green cards. Convoke to cast our Court of Calling. After this has already been shuffled back in, comes back into play. Second treasure. These get shuffled back into our library. And now we can move on to the 3rd part of our loop. So we've got 5 snakes in play, 4 are untapped, 2 treasures, and a lot of creatures at our disposal. Same 3 cards in our library. Since we've drawn our entire deck, we should have an Orcish Bowmaster in our hand. The goal of this loop is to deal damage, to make damage, so now we're going to do that with Orcish Bowmaster. Use our treasures, cast Bowmaster. We'll gain 2 life, trigger the Bowmaster, deal a point of damage. We can now loop our wolves again. Those are in play. We'll make 2 more untapped snakes, draw 2 cards, and for our 3rd time through the loop, I'm going to sacrifice my Orc army, target my Bowmaster, because if we want to make damage, we have to get Bowmaster to the graveyard. Remember that principle. Draw the 3rd card, and now we can do the same thing that we did with Innkeeper, but now with Bowmaster. Endurance, endurance, discard 2 green cards. We have plenty of creatures to cord. This is in the library because we stacked our triggers properly. This comes into play. These go to the graveyard. These shuffle. Opponent takes a point of damage. We gain 2 life. And we have just demonstrated another loop. This loop is limited by the number of green cards that you have access to. Every time you go through this loop, it's going to cost you 2 green cards. So if you have 30 green cards in your deck, you'll be able to do this loop 15 times, plus 1 additional time because you hard cast it. If you had mana available at the beginning of this loop, you'll be able to do more of it because you'll be able to hard cast the Bowmaster sooner, and every time you do that, it costs you less evokes with endurance to create mana with the Innkeepers. I hope that made sense. So that is loop 2. We have made damage, and then we can just keep doing that sequence over and over again. Draw 2 with the wolves, 2 cards to our hand, sack here, target here, this to the graveyard, draw the last card. We're making snakes in the process. Evoke 2 endurances, discard 2 cards, cord. This is in the library, bring it back into play. So you just need to demonstrate that you can discard 2 cards per point of an opponent's life each time you go through that loop. Let's move on to loop 3. Okay, loop 3, we are also going to be making damage. The difference between this loop and loop 2 is we don't have a library. We have these 3 cards in our graveyard, Bowmaster, Endurance, and Court of Calling. And we're going to try to create or make damage at a lower cost of 1 green card per loop as opposed to 2 green cards per loop. There are 3 steps to this sequence. The first is going to be shuffle. So in order to do that, we need to evoke an endurance, pitch a green card, and we're going to stack our triggers differently because we're only evoking 1 endurance. So we're going to have our evoke on the bottom, our shuffle on top. So we shuffle with the evoke trigger on the stack. We'll fire off one of the Chord of Callings in our hands. We're going to tap both wolves, endurance, Bowmaster token, and one of our snakes. So Chord is still on the stack. With the Chord on the stack, we're going to sack our Orc army. It's going to target itself, so it's going to fizzle, and then we'll let our Chord resolve. That's going to let us get our Bowmaster in play, which is step 2, make damage, Orc armies in play, ping our opponent for 1, we'll gain some life, Chord to the graveyard. We can now untap our wolves, draw 2 more cards, make 2 more snakes. We'll net 2 life. This endurance is also in the graveyard. Now we can reset that scenario. Sack the Bowmaster targeting itself, we don't have to draw, we lose a life. Evoke the endurance, discard a green card, fire off a Chord. We're going to hold priority. We have evoke and shuffle, stack the way I described last time. Sack the Bowmaster token targeting itself, Chord resolves, Bowmaster in play, Orc army, ping for 1, Chord goes to the graveyard, endurance goes to the graveyard, and we can continue to loop that. The cost there is 1 green card for 1 point of damage. After you've pitched all your green cards, you should have gained enough life where you can start sacrificing your creatures on board to put more green creatures into your graveyard to have more cards to pitch to endurance. These 4 creatures on board represent an additional 4 points of damage off of Bowmaster. An additional line you can take is if you're making mana with loop 1 or 2 or 3, happens at any point, you can continue that loop, make a 3rd treasure, put a Grist into play. The cost for that loop is going to be 4 green cards per time through the loop. Once Grist is in play, you can go through an additional 4 times, make 4 mana, proliferate Grist up to 5, discarding creatures from your hand when you're proliferating, ultimate the Grist to get extra points of damage in. These loops, they do require practice. As you can see, they are not intuitive, they are not easy, but ultimately follow along with the sheet that I've produced, study it, goldfish these loops as much as you can. The important thing is that you get comfortable with these loops, you go through them, you do repetitions with them, and ultimately being able to do them in a timely fashion is very important so you don't time out in tournament matches. But those are the 3 Inkeeper-Bowmaster-Endurance loops. Hope this tutorial has been helpful visualizing everything, and definitely download the PDF that I produced. That will help to, if you're a visual person or a kinesthetic person like myself, solidify what I just visualized here. Thank you guys for tuning in. I appreciate you making the contribution, helping get this video off the ground, and study up, and I hope it serves you well. Until next time, you know the deal, my friends. Be well.